We begin with murder charges being filed in the deadliest shooting ever to take place on a military base in the United States. Today, the U.S. Army officially charged Army Major Hasan with 13 counts of premeditated murder for the shooting rampage last week in Fort Hood, Texas, a shooting that left 12 military personnel and 1 civilian dead. These charges mean that Major Hasan would be eligible for the death penalty if he's ultimately convicted. Notably, Major Hasan will be tried in a military court rather than in a civilian court, which could potentially be an important distinction in this case. According to some legal analysis, the fact that the government is planning to try Hasan in military court may suggest that the evidence says he acted alone. The assumption is that if investigators thought he was part of some bigger conspiracy, some larger plot, it's more likely that the case would have been moved to federal court. Again, the specific charge here is premeditated murder, 13 counts of premeditated murder. And while officials say that more charges could be coming, so far, there's been no announcement of any legal charges related to terrorism. In fact, the FBI seemed to explicitly rule that out in a statement today, saying, quote, "At this point, there is no information to indicate Major Malik Hasan had any co-conspirators or was part of a broader terrorist plot." That, of course, has not stopped the people who are trying to make political hay out of this tragedy from insisting that this act must be called terrorism.
It was a travesty. It should never have happened. And what we ought to be calling it is just that, terrorism.
All right. Why can't we say, Nina, that this was an act of terrorism? Why can't the president say that? Why can't our government say that?
I believe it was an act of terror.
There are very, very strong warning signs here that Dr. Hasan had become an Islamist extremist, and therefore that this was a terrorist act.
And the Army and the FBI are saying that we should not call this a terrorist attack. Do you agree with that assessment?
No, absolutely not. This looks a whole lot like terrorism.
There's no question that Hasan is a terrorist. It is an act of war perpetrated by a Muslim terrorist who believes that infidels should die.
He murdered Americans in cold blood, an act of bald-faced extremist Muslim terrorism.
An act of bald-faced extremist Muslim terrorism. The insistence on this point from critics of the administration eager to charge the president with a terrorist attack on his watch.
The president and the Army and the FBI are saying that we should not call this a terrorist attack. Do you agree with that assessment?
No, absolutely not. This looks a whole lot like terrorism, but you need to remember the orientation of this administration. It was a few months ago that they said, we don't want to use the word terrorism. We want to use the term man-made disaster. It's the kind of things that lead you to have a policy where they want to read Miranda rights to the people that we capture in Afghanistan, and they want to prosecute CIA agents for the things that the previous president in Congress asked our CIA people to do.
Remember this one? Yes, it is the old paint the Democrats as soft on terror routine. But in order to play that politicizing terrorism anti-Democrat greatest hit, the Fort Hood case has to be terrorism. Now, regardless of how you feel about the political issue of politicizing terrorism, it's worth asking, was Fort Hood, technically speaking, terrorism? It's not just a political question. It's not just a judgment call. It's not just a matter of taste. It's a question to which there is an answer, a legal answer. And the charges today didn't include anything related to terrorism. Terrorism is not just conceptual political jargon. This is a legal term, and it has, interestingly, changed over the past few years. In order for something to be legally considered terrorism, do you have to be taking instructions from a terrorist group? Do you have to have some sort of clear political motive behind the violence? Is it about the way that you commit the crime? What sort of weapons that you use in doing? Is it about how many people that you kill in your crime? Is it about the specific type of people you target, whether they're civilian or military? If you're interested in more than just making political hay out of the Fort Hood case, these are the sort of legitimate questions you would want to ask before labeling this or any case an instance of terrorism. Those who are calling this terrorism are making their case in large part because Major Hasan is a Muslim and because he's alleged to have said God is great before the shootings. And while it might make for exciting politics to argue that murders committed by religious Muslims are presumptively terrorist acts, those exciting political allegations actually say a lot more about the people making them than they do about the real character of the tragedy at Fort Hood and how we as a country should respond to it. Joining us now is Jonathan Turley, professor of constitutional law at George Washington University Law School. I should note that Professor Turley is currently involved in 2 unrelated terrorism cases right now. Jonathan, thanks very much for joining us.
Hi, Rachel.
What are the specific charges filed against Major Hasan today? 13 counts of premeditated murder. What do those charges tell us about what investigators believe about this case?
Well, first of all, I think that the Army is going about this in the right way. In fact, they're taking a very measured and unprejudiced view. They're actually investigating a crime. Criminal investigators and lawyers and judges don't have the luxury that some people have on television to just simply say this must be terrorism. Why? Because we want it to be terrorism. Words have meaning in the criminal code, and that's what brings the integrity to the code. It brings its legitimacy. And you can't just simply say that because somebody kills a large number of people that it's terrorism. There are plenty of people that act out of rage. If you take away a few of the aspects of this case, you would have a typical disgruntled worker shooting. We have these shootings all over the country where people are disturbed and disgruntled and isolated, and they come in and they shoot people in their workplace. Now, some of them are perfectly unhinged, and they will latch on to religious views or political views, but what they're really acting out of is mental illness. And so when you really want to do justice, then you first have to start by defining what the crime is. And I think that these investigators have done a good job. They don't see evidence thus far that he's an actual terrorist.
Obviously, neither you nor I have access to the internal workings of this investigation. We know what's been released publicly and what's in that charge sheet. Would that charge sheet have looked significantly different if they had evidence that this was definitely an act of terrorism? Would you, as a lawyer, be looking to that charge sheet expecting to see something else?
Yeah, I would be expecting a couple of things. One is the possibility of sending it to a military tribunal. The UCMJ, the military code, actually doesn't have a terrorism provision. It would go to a military tribunal, or they would waive jurisdiction, give it to the federal prosecutors. And there's a whole bunch of federal prosecutors who would eagerly take a terrorism case. There doesn't seem to have been that type of consideration given here. This seems to be moving towards a conventional, what's called Article 2 military trial. And so all indications, from what we know from what's been publicly released, is that they believe that this is premeditated murder. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have religious overtones, and it doesn't mean that he was not radicalized in some degree. But terrorism is more than just killing people. I mean, you and I have talked about this previously, that we're becoming a nation where we want to define everything as terrorism, all criminals as terrorists. We have a shooting of an abortion doctor. It's terrorism. And anyone that seems to be acting against strangers because of who they are, a hate crime, is terrorism. Well, it's not. It's murder in most of these cases. And there's not a strong indication yet that he crossed that line. Terrorism is when you not just murder someone, but you're murdering someone to coerce or intimidate a government or society for a religious or political or ideological reason. Now, he may have had those deep felt feelings, but there's no indication that he went into this location for that purpose or part of a broader plot. Most of the indications is that he was is a deeply disturbed individual who released his hate on these people.
In terms of terrorism as a cogent legal construct, it is about motive, which raises the question for me, is it possible for an insane person to commit an act of terrorism? Because if you are judged to be insane within the judicial system, as far as I understand it, that makes the whole idea of your motives not actually apply in the same way they would for a sane person. So is insanity and terrorism two mutually exclusive legal constructs?
Well, it actually is it's a rather poignant question, isn't it? Because anyone who is a terrorist is by definition somewhat insane. I mean, when you go and you believe that God will reward you by killing innocent people, you really do have to have a screw loose. But in terms of the military system, to make an insanity defense is no easy task. I've practiced in the military system, and the standard there is that he does not, if he wants to be proven insane, he has to, his lawyer has to show that he did not understand the wrongfulness of his actions. Well, that's a standard that is virtually impossible to satisfy. It's also the standard that mimics the federal standard, where we saw with people like Zacharias Moussaoui, who was a barking lunatic, he was still found to be sane. So the chances that he can use insanity are rather slim. But I think that what you are going to have, unless we see some new evidence, is a conventional trial for premeditated murder. He's unlikely to have much of a shot towards insanity. I expect his lawyers may try. And without that defense, then he may be looking at a lead pipe cinch of a conviction and death sentence.
Jonathan Turley, constitutional law professor at George Washington University Law School, as always, helping us be more precise and therefore more accurate. Thanks for your time tonight, Jonathan.
Thanks, Rachel.